We are recording the interview of Dick Bidlack. This interview is being conducted by David Berry and Jennifer Swavey from Wright State University's Veteran Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at Champaign Aviation Museum in Urbana, Ohio. It is 1 p.m. on February 4th, 2017. Let's start with where and when were you born?
I was born in June of '34 up in northwestern Ohio, Paulding County, up between Lima and Defiance.
Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
Well, my dad was Ansel Bidlack, my mother was Vivian, and Dad was a farmer and a postmaster. He was a postmaster up in Paulding County for 42 years. Of course, Mom and Dad are gone now. Mom was a housemaker. I was the oldest of 6 kids on the farm. And lost one brother so far. I'm the oldest of 6. I had one brother, Tom, passed away about 3 years ago. He was 3 years younger than I am.
Did any of your siblings serve in the military?
My brother Tom was the only one, and he was in the Army for a short period of time, but not in Vietnam. He was just 2 years back in the 60s after college. I'm the only one.
What did you do before you went into the military?
Well, I came in when I was 19 years old, so I had gone to college at Defiance College for a year, and then I joined the Air Force in the summer of '53 and was accepted for flight training and got my commission in April of '55 and my wings, and then I retired in '73. But luckily I flew airplanes just about 20 years in the Air Force.
Before you joined, what were you going to college for?
Wanted to be an engineer. I thought I did. Thought I wanted to be an engineer, but there were some people in the office that I worked part-time while I was in college that were pilots in World War II and Korea, and I'd hear those guys talk about airplanes and pilots, and I said, I got to do that. And I was lucky to do it. I just signed up one day with a recruiting NCO in Defiance, and I was young and gullible and thought that nobody would be lying to me, and as it turned out, he wasn't. But he didn't know that. But I swallowed it and was accepted for pilot training in the old aviation cadet program. At that time, after the Air Force Academy started putting out cadets in 1959. The cadet program that had gone back to the 20s and 30s, certainly before World War II, was discontinued. But I went through the old Air Force Aviation Cadet program, not to be confused with the Air Force Academy. So for 15 months you were a cadet. You wore a cadet uniform, but you also were in flight training at the same time. And I was down in Texas, and you couldn't hardly be in the Air Force and fly and not spend a lot of time in Texas. So that's what I did.
What was the difference from the school that you were in versus the Air Force Academy?
Well, the Air Force Academy is a 4-year college graduate program, and they do not take flight training. Sometimes they take an introduction to flight training, but they learn to fly after the academy. And the Air Force Academy is like the West Point Academy or the Naval Academy or the Coast Guard Academy. It's a 4-year military college or university. And then you learn to fly after that. With a cadet program, the aviation cadet program, you are there to learn to fly, but you're also there to be an officer. So there's an awful lot of officer training, marching, square corners, double time, a lot of inspections and stuff like that. And you were a cadet, and you were addressed as Mr. I was Mr. Bidlack, just like the academies do. Everybody's Mr. But it's not to be confused with an academic program.
So did you go straight, when you joined the military, did you go straight to this cadet program, or did you go through basic training
No,
first?
not straight into it. A good question. I had to join up, was sent to upstate New York, and went through Air Force basic training, which was pretty easy compared to what I understand the Marines and other people go through. But it was 6 weeks of learning how to wear a uniform and salute and march and stuff like that. And then I was sent down to Mississippi in the late summer of '53 to Keesler Air Force Base for technical training. And I became a radar operator, ground radar operator. And at that time, I had taken the aviation cadet application. It was a big physical and a psychiatric exam and stuff like that, to whether in a physical, and was accepted for cadets. You got to meet. You couldn't wear glasses as a cadet, so you had to have uncorrected 20/20 vision. Kind of joking aside, you had to walk and chew gum at the same time. You couldn't be a stumbling oaf. So you had to be able to hear and read and stuff like that. It was pretty selective. Once you got selected to be an aviation cadet, it was a good deal. And then I was sent to San Antonio, and then down to southern Texas, and ended up in Laredo, Texas, and got my wings and commission. And in April, like I said, April of '55, I got my wings and commission at the same time. My mother came down from Ohio and pinned my wings on me, and I was a second lieutenant.
So you were enlisted when you were
Yes,
doing
I
the
was
ground
enlisted.
radar
I
operating?
started out as an enlisted man for 6 months until I became an aviation cadet. And you're still technically enlisted, although it was a cadet status, so it was a little different. But yeah, I enlisted in the Air Force for 6 months, and then it took 6 months from June until January the next year. I started in the cadet program in Waco, Texas, and then San Antonio, and down to Laredo, and got my wings. And yep.
What was the hardest part going from enlisted working as a ground radar operator to...
Well, in the cadet program, especially the first 6 weeks at Lackland Air Force Base in pre-cadets, it was all double time inspections, yes sir, no sir, square corners. There was a lot of knowledge that you were thrown at you, that you had to regurgitate. And if you get gigs, you had to go out and walk them off. Sometime if you got a problem, if your uniform wasn't correct, or you did something that an upperclassman didn't approve of, they would give you what we called a gig, and you had to walk a tour and walk those things off, and so you wouldn't do them again. You made a mistake, and there was certain knowledge. For example, one of the things you had to learn by memory was George Washington's final address to his officers when he resigned from the Army, which his address to his troops for his final year, and we had to regurgitate that, and it was about 50 or 60 words. It took 15 seconds to read off. I can't remember it anymore, but I remember the gist of it.
What was the gist of it?
Well, take care of your country, and do your country proud. Yeah.
Sounds like a good thing to have memorized. Do you recall any of your instructors, and if so, what were they like?
You know what? Yeah, I remember Marty McLaughlin was my flight instructor in primary pilot training down in, I said Texas, but for once I went 6 months in Florida for primary pilot training. And that's where you first solo in a trainer. And Marty McLaughlin was my instructor, and these were civilian instructors. We were in an air base, not an Air Force base, an air base, and it's a difference. There's a technical difference. And it was manned as a civilian contract school, but we were all Air Force cadets. And the civilian instructors wore a gray uniform. We wore our regular Air Force uniforms and flight suits and so forth. And my instructor in primary pilot training for 6 months in Marianna, Florida, was Marty McLaughlin. I doubt if he's still around. If he is, he'd be pushing 100 years old. I've kind of regretted not looking him up years ago, but it's too late now. And then my advanced pilot, basic pilot training, then he went back, I was down in Laredo, Texas. And my instructor there was an Air Force lieutenant, and I was a second lieutenant, of course. And he was Jim Fitzpatrick was my instructor, and he was an Air Force lieutenant. And that was 6 months, and flying the T-33 down in Texas. And then I got picked for, I flew F-89s and F-86s as interceptor pilot, and so on and so forth. Went to school a lot the first 10 years in the Air Force. I was in school constantly, training in different airplanes and things like that.
Was it easier to have Air Force instructors than civilian instructors?
No, not necessarily. The civilian instructors didn't care about this military, like Washington's address and things like that. They were there to teach us to fly. But when we get out of the classroom, then we came under the upperclassmen, and that's where we continued the military training at nights and things like that. But when you were in the classroom or in the airplane with your civilian instructor, it was relaxed. I mean, compared to later on when I went to Laredo, and then you had a military, then everything was military. Instructors, of course, everything. Now the airplanes we flew in primary had the bar and star on them. They were Air Force airplanes, but they were being flown by civilian instructors under contract. And that program quit soon after I was out of there. In fact, it got stopped. The Air Force Academy was built started in 1955. That's when I got my wings, and became a second lieutenant on the same day. That's the day that year, the summer of '55, the first Air Force cadets for the new Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, Colorado. They entered, and they graduated as second lieutenants in 1959. By that time, I was flying the F-86s and was an instructor and so forth, and we got some of those young lieutenants from the Air Force Academy upgrading in advanced flight school in the F-86. But and then the aviation cadet program was phased out over a year's period. They just didn't take any more into it. And then the only way that you can go to pilot training today, and back in those days, that started in the 60s, is you had to go either to ROTC and get your commission in ROTC, ROTC, get your second lieutenant, and then go be accepted for flight training at a military base. And the civilian contract schools were going by that time. Or be accepted into the Air Force Academy. So the cadet program that I was in doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't existed since the 60s. Because we went in out of high school. You had to be 18 years old and a high school graduate. Today, to be a pilot or a navigator, you gotta have a 4-year college degree. That's all there is to it.
So you didn't have a college degree before you got your commission in wings?
Never did.
Wow.
I had 1 year of college, and I was 19 when I went into the cadet program. But there were 18-year-old kids right out of high school in the cadet program. But later on, the Air Force wanted all officers to be a college graduate and all NCOs to be high school graduates. So that wasn't the case before, during World War II. There were a lot of 18, 19-year-old kids flying fighters in World War II and World War I.
Other than the primary pilot training and your ground radar operations, did you receive any specialty training?
Well, every time after you got your wings in this case the T-33 trainer, which was a jet trainer down in Laredo, Texas. That's not a combat airplane, so it was a trainer. So you had to go to advanced pilot training, and you either went to bombers or cargo airplane or to fighters. And I always wanted to be a fighter pilot. And I applied, and out of my graduating class, there were 6 slots for pilot training. Everybody else went to bombers or cargo airplanes. I didn't want to be a bomber pilot. I wanted to be a fighter pilot, from stuff I had read when I was a kid in World War II and things like that. And I got accepted for advanced flight school in the F-86. There was several versions of the F-86. I flew the 86L and later the F-102 Delta. And then you learn to fly an airplane with a mission, not a training mission. In this case, it was an interceptor or a fighter airplane. And that was a 6-month school after I had my wings. And you still didn't have much experience, obviously. So it took a couple of years on the line as a young lieutenant fighter pilot before you were worth a damn. Because you just had to fly and get the experience. And until you had 1,000, 1,500, 2,000 hours, the Air Force kept a pretty tight rein on you. Your weather minimums were usually a little higher and things like that. And then by the time I went to Vietnam in '64, I had 2,000 hours of interceptor of fighter time as the first pilot in a fighter, and that was required to fly the Voodoo because it was a high-performance airplane, and that's what I flew in Vietnam. Even though I flew the F-86, which was a pretty, comparatively speaking, was a fun airplane to fly, but it was going out of the inventory, the F-86, and then I got selected for the Voodoo as an unarmed reconnaissance airplane, and that's what I flew for 3 years in Vietnam and Japan.
And then, why were you selected for fighter pilot instead of bomber or cargo?
For fear of having this taken wrong, there's a hierarchy in the Air Force and in the military and in the Navy. The top of the class of most of the pilot training classes flew fighters. They wanted to go to fighters because it was just more fun to fly a fighter than to herd around with 5 or 6 or 10 other guys in a bomber or a cargo airplane. And it just drone and drone and drone and drone, and it never appealed to me. And I did fly later on, just before I retired. I flew C-47 a little bit, and I flew a Convair, which was a 40-passenger airplane, just before I retired in '73. But I spent most of my life flying fighters, so I was lucky. That was my personal opinion, but I had a lot of company about fighter pilots had more fun. It's just more fun to be in that airplane alone than having to worry. Didn't have to worry about anybody else.
Then, how did you adapt to military life?
It was a piece of cake. My dad was a strong disciplinarian. Didn't put up with any baloney. So putting up with military was a piece of cake. We didn't do much when up in Paulding County up there. We didn't have TV when I was a kid. It just wasn't around. We lived on a dairy farm, milked cows 7 days a week, twice a day at 6 in the morning and 6 at night, 7 days a week. And I thought military training was a piece of cake. because we worked on the farm. So shoot, driving an airplane was easy. It's kind of, I always jokingly tell people that Dad wouldn't let me fly drive a $3,000 tractor, but the Air Force let me fly a $30 million fighter. So.
Was the physical aspect of it difficult for you?
The what?
The physical aspect, PT and physical training?
No. We did a lot of physical training and stuff like that in cadets and in pilot, but you know, when you're 19, weigh 150, 160 pounds, you can go all day. At least you thought you could.
So you said that you served overseas in Vietnam and Japan?
I was sent to Japan to the squadron in the December of '63 after I'd been flying the F-86. And I was selected then for the one, well, I applied for it. Because after you've been in an assignment for 3 or 4 years back then, it was time to rotate to another assignment. And you look at the options for us that were out there, and one of them, and I'd heard about, was this RF-101 Voodoo in South Carolina. And I said, that sounds like fun. And I went out there and visited and talked to some guys, and I said, that's for me. And I applied for it and was accepted. So that was in the spring of '63, and I went to recce training, reconnaissance training, in the summer of '63, and graduated. It was a 4-month school where I checked out in the Voodoo in South Carolina, and graduated on November 22nd of '63. And for those who weren't here, that's the day Kennedy got killed. So I always forget that, or always will never forget that. And then I was on my way to Japan and went to Japan in '63. And then the following 6 months later, they deployed part of our squadron to Southeast Asia. And Vietnam was starting to build up in the early to mid '60s. And I flew my first mission, combat mission, in April of '64. And there were 3 jets in Vietnam, 3 101s. That was it. No, and we were not there. We could not tell the press we were there. We would meet newspaper people or press people in Saigon, and we were in civilian clothes. But we looked, you know, I guess because of our hair and so on, and we were, by that time I was 29 years old. They would come up to us and said, do you know anything? Are you guys in the military? I says, well, yeah, sort of. Well, what do you do? Well, I can't tell you. Well, do you know anything about those airplanes, those jet airplanes that are out there at Tan Son Nhut, which was the airport at Saigon, Tan Son Nhut Air Base? Don't know what you're talking about. We were not allowed to tell anybody, but there were 3 101s and a half a dozen pilots, and we were starting to take reconnaissance pictures. Up on the DMZ, we couldn't go into North Vietnam, but we were going up to Laos, Vien Vien Phu, and all over into South Vietnam, and started taking pictures. And slowly over the next 2 years, the thing has escalated until we first went to North Vietnam in '65. And I'll never forget that. Then we started getting shot at, seriously. It was a different war. The war then became no fun anymore, because earlier on it was just flying and taking pictures, and we didn't get shot at or anything, or at least if we did, we didn't know we were. We were a little bit naive, but then we started flying serious combat in '65. When I say serious, we were getting shot at.
So while you were taking reconnaissance, what was some of the duties that you had to perform?
Well, as a reconnaissance pilot, you mean what was the mission of flying the 101, or what did we do for other?
What did you do during your time in Vietnam?
Well, flew every day. We would fly, generally speaking, as it got more and more, we would go down there and fly for 10 days in a row. Fly 1 or 2 missions every day. I mean, by the time the end of that day, you were a tired puppy. You wanted to go, you wanted to have a beer and go to bed. And we would fly 10 days and get 1 day off. Then fly 10 days and get 1 day off. Now, in the meantime, our families, my wife and 2 youngest children, or 2 oldest children now, I've got 3 grown children now, but they were still up in Japan. So we were going back and forth over the next 3-year period. We would fly an airplane from northern Japan, 400 miles north of Tokyo, to Vietnam. And that would take a day to do that, because even though that airplane cruised at 500 knots, which is 600 miles an hour, we would go from Japan to Okinawa, refuel, on down to the Philippines and refuel, and then on over to Saigon. And that was usually we could make that in one day, but it was a busy day, because that was a long trip. It was over 3,000 miles. We could not get in-flight refueling because they just didn't have any refueling tankers over there, but later on we did. So a third of the squadron was in Vietnam, and the rest of the squadron was in northern Japan, and that's where our wives and families were. And we were going back and forth, and slowly kept building up. And so that by the time in the end of my 3 years, in '66, summer '66, you were considered to have completed a combat tour. And a combat tour at that time was an cumulative total of 365 days in Southeast Asia. You go down there for 2 or 3 or 4 months at a time, and then back up to Japan for 3 or 4 months, and then back down to Vietnam for 3 or 4 months. But you had to have an accumulative total of 365 days, and they kept changing that. And plus you had to have 100 missions over North Vietnam. The missions over South Vietnam and Laos didn't count, even though you were being shot at. And so once you got 100 missions over North Vietnam, assuming you were still not a POW, and I knew a lot of POWs, and was lucky I wasn't one myself, then you were eligible for a reassignment back to the States.
How did you feel when your fellow military men became a POW?
Well, it was traumatic. And it's the old thing, it's going to happen to somebody, the other guy, and not going to happen to me. That's kind of naive attitude, but that keeps you going. But yeah, I remember the day Dan Dowdy got shot down. I was supposed to fly that mission, but there was an airplane scheduled crew change or something, and he flew tail number 172. Each airplane had a tail number, and in fact, the RF-101 Voodoo that's at the Air Force Museum is tail number 166, and I flew that airplane in Vietnam. That airplane that was in my squadron. So when you had a buddy, we lost. I remember the first guy that got killed was Bob Stubberfield, and he was about the second or third mission into North Vietnam, and I think he pushed it. We were taking pictures below 500 feet at 500 or 600 knots, and we were taking pictures of anti-aircraft sites and other targets. And I think he flew right into a AAA site, aircraft artillery site. And we saw pictures later on. We saw pictures of the back of the airplane and the drag chute, because we had a drag chute that popped out of the tail to help you slow down on landing. And it was deployed for some reason. I don't know why. It wasn't a personnel chute, because it was a ring slot chute. But Bob Stubberfield was the first guy in our squadron to get shot down, and then we lost a dozen guys out of 22. So,
was that mostly from anti-aircraft artillery?
Yep. Missiles and small arms fire. We didn't worry too much about MiGs. I mean, you worried about them, but we could outfly a MiG at that time in the 101. We were faster than they were, and we had our own onboard radar warning system that told you that you were being tracked by North Vietnamese radar, and you could jam it. And if you knew that an aircraft was getting on your tail, we could go into double afterburner. This is twin-engine airplane. Go into double afterburner and roll the airplane upside down and take the load off the wing, and there wasn't anything that could stand behind us. We could get out of there. So we didn't worry about the MiGs or the MiGs or the surface-to-air missiles, the SAM-2s. I mean, they were scary. You saw that flying telephone pole, as we used to call them. It was white, and it was 30 feet long and about that big around, and it was chasing you pretty fast because it was 3 times faster than it, and it would catch up with you. But there were some things that we could do to defeat it. But we lost buddies, and I lost a lot of buddies that either got killed or got shot down and became POWs. Scotty Morgan was one of the first. He lives down in Asheville, North Carolina. We never had a recce pilot that died in Vietnam as a POW. Once they became a POW, but they were there for 6 and 6.5 and 7 years. And people just can't even comprehend that. And we have reunions, and it's something we'll take with us to our grave. About you go up there and meet those guys. We got a couple of POWs around here that flew F4s that I know, and you come back sometimes with an airplane, and you say, "Hey, Sarge," the crew chief would meet you when you bring the airplane back. "How's the airplane, Captain?" And I said, "Hey, it's a good airplane, but I can't. One of my cameras is not working." "Oh, okay, I'll check it out." So we write it up in the discrepancy log, and he checked out. And I remember several times, 30 minutes later, after I'm going back into operations for debriefing, the crew chief would come back in, and he says, "Captain Bidlack, you know why your camera didn't work?" And I says, "No, what?" He said, "You come out here and I'll show you." Well, it had been hit by a small arms fire. Luckily, it was not an engine or something like that. I didn't care about a camera being shot down. We cared, but it wasn't earth-shaking. But we came back with bullet holes in, didn't know you'd been shot at, if everything's working. But they were small arms. They were rifles. And what they would do, the North Vietnamese, is there'd be a squad of men, and they knew an airplane was, and they could see us coming. They just hold up their rifles and just pull automatic, and you fly through it. They didn't have to take aim, and they weren't aiming at it. They just barrage fire straight up, and you flew through it. Well, a jet airplane going at 600 knots is pretty vulnerable. And all it's got to do is hit in the wrong place, one small arm wrong, and they learned a lot about designing airplanes from all that, but you were pretty vulnerable.
How did you stay in touch with family and friends back home?
Snail mail, that's all we had. You wrote a letter. My wife and I were talking about it the other day. The young people today can't fathom being out of touch for 3 years. Maybe once a year you'd make a phone call, but a transatlantic, trans-Pacific telephone call in the 60s was hard to do. So you wrote a card, you wrote a letter every week to mom and dad, and and you get a letter back. That's how you stayed in touch. I mean, they're just today you pick up your cell phone and call worldwide for they just take it for granted, but it wasn't that way. When we were in Vietnam, we didn't. Our wives were 4,000 miles north of us. We didn't talk to them. We'd sent letters back and forth from Vietnam to Japan.
What kinds of friendships and camaraderie did you form while serving in the military? Lifetime.
Got buddies that we stayed. I called Jimmy Wiley the other day. I had a question about, but we stay in touch. When you go through combat with somebody, and this has been reiterated many times in books and novels, things like that, but it's a fact. I was never in a foxhole, but we were in combat, and we flew together, and then we would celebrate at night that we were still alive and ready to go fly another mission. So you get close. You get close to the guys, and we have been going we recce pilots, recce being short for reconnaissance. We recce guys have been getting together for the last 35 years, the 101 guys. There were only 220 of these airplanes built, and there were 6 squadrons, so that wasn't very many compared to other units. We were kind of a unique bunch. In the first place, to fly the airplane, you had to have a couple of thousand hours pilot training, and so we were all captains and majors by that time. We'd been around the block a little bit, so to speak. But we get together for reunions, and the war stories keep getting better and better. I mean, every year we became better pilots than we were. Just ask us. Yeah, you get close, and we stay in touch, and we're losing them. We're all 80 years old now, 80, 82, 83. Lost Dick Wood just a while back, and I lose 1 or 2 every year now. So I don't know. We don't know whether we're going to have another reunion or not, because we're just, some of the guys just can't get up and around. I feel people are surprised that I'm almost 83. I feel pretty good. I don't know what you're supposed to feel like at 83, but yeah, we got close. We get close with their families, their kids, their wives. We're all family.
When you were overseas, what did you do for recreation when you weren't on duty?
We drank. No, no, we didn't. I mean, people, that gets kind of exaggerated. When I was in Japan at 3 years and in Vietnam, when we were back up in Japan, we did some traveling. I remember one time we took my wife and my daughter was 4, and my son, they're now in their 50s. But I remember we took a ship. We flew down to Tokyo on a military airplane. You could do that overseas. Take your family on a military airplane, a big cargo airplane. Thank goodness for somebody that was flying them. It wasn't me, but I was happy for somebody else to fly me. We went to Tokyo and got on a cruise ship and went down to Okinawa and over to Japan, China, and back up to Korea and back, and spent a couple of weeks. It didn't cost us a thing. It was amazing. But you could do that back then because you were on a military ship that had rooms for family. It was a Navy ship. It was a cargo ship, but it had rooms or places to sleep, and we had our kids with us. And we traveled around Japan. There was a lot to see in Japan. We got into guns. A lot of us liked to shoot, and we could go hunting in Japan and in Korea. We did some of that, but we were just, when you got home, you were family, and we continued to train. When we went back up to Japan, we continued to fly. Because we had half the airplanes up in Japan, and we would continue to fly 2 or 3 times a week, training missions, just to keep sharp. So we stayed busy.
What would you hunt in Japan?
Pheasants. It was funny, and in Korea, there were islands, and it was amazing. Ringtail pheasant, like we've got around here, but we don't see very many of them, but we had a lot of them over there. And of course, the ringtail pheasant came from the Far East. It's not indigenous to the States. But you could go over there and shoot those things and get 2 or 3 a day, and it was fun. It was fun going hunting over there.
Where were you when the war ended?
Oh, well, the war was over in 73 or 74, the last time, and I had just retired. But I remember in the spring of 73 when the POWs were released. I was down in South Carolina, where I had checked out in the 101, and I came back there after I went to Europe, and then I came back and then retired out of South Carolina. But my wife and I hosted a coming home party for the POWs, and we had 7 of the POWs in our house that night, that weekend. And got pretty emotional
Oh, yeah.
when those guys came home, and it was about a week after they got released and came back to the States, but they were with their family and their own parents, and then we had a party, but so that was the end of the, but you know, we always had, most of us that flew just realized that Vietnam War was a waste, a big waste. And the people that were calling the shots, from Lyndon Johnson to McNamara to General Maxwell Taylor, on and on these generals, it was sinful, the things that we were doing in North Vietnam and Vietnam. I think, as I look back on it, it's a bad taste in our mouth. We weren't very smart. I don't think the government, the people that were running the business of a country, were very smart. You know, when we came home, we were told not to wear our uniforms. I remember when we in the summer of '66, we flew into California from Japan, and don't wear uniforms because the people were parading about anti-war stuff. That's sad. Luckily, that changed with the guys in Afghanistan and Iraq and other places. Guys and gals now, you know, there just weren't any women flying back then when I was around, but I'm glad they are. God bless them. I think they can do anything a man can do. But being the father of 2 daughters, but yeah, there were books written. The things that went on over there in South Vietnam were sinful, just sinful. A lot of bad memories in that respect. Well, we knew you'd lose a buddy, and it was ridiculous that he even went on the mission. We were asked to do a lot of dumb things. Unarmed reconnaissance, there isn't such a thing anymore. Unarmed reconnaissance started in World War I and certainly in World War II, a lot of it, and in Korea. But by that time, there's today, reconnaissance is done by satellites and by drones. So there is no more flying reconnaissance. To my knowledge, I don't think there are. But they used to send us on missions to go get photography of let's say there's a bridge or a dam, a target in North Vietnam. So they wanted it to be bombed. And so it would be F-100s or F-105 Thunder Chiefs. And they'd go up and they would bomb. And they wanted us to come in and come across at 200 feet and get pictures, pre-strike photography. We would pull off. By that time, we've alerted them, right? There's a voodoo came over. A voodoo. What's coming next? Some bombers would come in. F-105 bombers, fighter bombers, or F-100s or F-4s. And so they're waiting for them. And they're shooting. They're shooting. You were just a duck. And then they wanted us to come back in behind them and get post-strike photography. So wait a minute. I'll come back in 6 hours or tomorrow. That bridge is still going to be there, or what's left of it. Oh, well, yeah, okay. I mean, it was so dumb to some of the missions. And we were taking multi-million-dollar fighters and trying to drop a log across a creek and call it a bridge. I mean, it was so wasteful. It was so wasteful. And I'm only exaggerating a little bit. Vietnam was a waste. It was sad. Lost too many buddies. It wasn't worth it.
You said that you were told not to wear a uniform when you were coming home. How were you received by your family and community?
Oh, great. Glad to have us home. you know, because it was on TV what was going on in Vietnam. You know, Vietnam was the first war that was televised. And, oh yeah, when it was good, you know, good homecoming.
How did you readjust to civilian life?
Oh, that didn't take very long. You know, that was a piece of cake, except we'd get together, and as more and more reports came in, we realized how stupid the whole thing was. I remember after Desert Storm and back in the you know, 10 years ago, Schwarzkopf and some of those people, and some of the generals in the Air Force today, and some of them are retired now. They said they learned it from us, and the things that they learned in Vietnam applied in Desert Storm, and they did. They learned, guys like Schwarzkopf and other generals, General Hunter Harris for the Air Force and others. They'd come back to Congress or to the president and said, "Bullshit, we do not need," excuse me, I hope that, "we do not need to do it. This is the way to do this." And the lessons that were learned in Vietnam were applied in Desert Storm. And it went like clockwork. It really did. But it took it was expensive experience.
Now you said that your old unit, the 100 or 101, has gotten together for the past 35 years. How did that start? Did you guys start?
The first one was down in Hot Springs, Arkansas, in about 1980. And then I hosted two of them, one in 94 and one in 2013 at the Air Force Museum. And we got together different places around the country: Seattle, Tucson, Austin, just to name, Fort Walton Beach, Florida, a couple of times. Shaw Air Force Base, where we all learned how to fly the 101, and that's the home of, used to be considered to be the home of recce, home of reconnaissance. So we would, somebody would volunteer to be the host, and I did it twice. And the reason we did it here is obviously because of the Air Force Museum, and everybody wanted to come up. So that was, and we might do it again someday, but it's a lot of work to put one together. And we stay in a in a hotel downtown or someplace, and set up a hospitality suite. And it usually goes for 4 days, a long weekend, but we learned to do it on Tuesday through Friday because it was cheaper. We were all retired, so what the hell, we didn't have to go for the weekend. And we had more fun that way. We had things more off. And Kansas City, I remember going to Kansas City and we'd get together and just once a year say, hey, you know, we stayed in touch with each other, but to see each other. And I don't know, we're just about maybe have had the last one. I don't know. If it does, it's too bad. That was in Louisville, Kentucky last spring. So, and in the Air Force Museum, the 101 that's there, a lot of us flew it. And they would open it up and let us get in it. So it was funny to see some of those old guys get up in there and start blubbering and crying. Yeah. Brought back a lot of memories to crawl into an airplane that became a big part of your life. I got 1,000 hours in the 101, but there were some guys that had 1,500 and 2,000 hours, and Ray Tifo and Rich Richardson had 3,000 hours in that airplane. That's a lot of time in a single-seat airplane.
Are you a member of any veteran organizations?
Yeah, but I don't. I'm a member of the Dedalians, which is a military pilot fraternity. And I'm a lifetime member, but I don't go to very many of the meetings. I'm a member of the Quiet Birdmen, which is a pilot organization, but it's not military pilots. It's not just military pilots. It's any pilot. But it's a pilot organization. But no, I don't go to too many military things.
What have you done since separating from the military?
When I retired from the Air Force in '73, I wanted to keep flying, and I flew for the next 22 years as a civilian pilot. I flew all kind. I was a dealer, an aircraft dealer down in Springfield for 10 years. I did a lot of charter flying, and I sold airplanes. And I retired from the Air Force in '73 with 6,000 hours of fighter airplane time total, which was kind of typical, 6,000 hours over a 20-year as a pilot in the Air Force. I flew another 12,000 hours as a civilian pilot. I flew a lot and flew all over the United States and eastern Canada. I took an airplane, delivered a couple airplanes to South America. I went to Alaska and brought some airplanes back. I was an instructor, did check rides. So I flew for until 15 years ago. And then when I got 70 years old or pushing 70, it was time to quit.
How did your wartime experience affect your life?
Well, it made me question what's going on in Washington, D.C. That's for damn sure. Most military pilots are Republican, conservative Republicans. There's not very many liberal Democrats in the military. It made us question, and which I think needs to be, young people need to do more and more of that. And you don't need to be destructive to do that, but you need to question and become involved.
What are some life lessons you learned from your military service?
I'm not sure I can. I have to think about that. Life lessons. I'll tell you one thing: appreciate what you got. Appreciate the family. It just makes it all sweeter somehow. Yeah, I got my son was born in November of 50. Yeah, 58. No, it was before that. He lives in Seattle, he and his wife. He's a computer programmer, has his own business. He's got his doctorate in music, but he writes. Anyway, then my oldest daughter is an artist and busy. Hey, Chase.
How are you?
So they remember the military, my son and oldest daughter. My youngest daughter was born when I was in Norway just before I came back in '73. And she's a professor at the University of Alaska in Juneau. And so you appreciate, to answer your question, you just appreciate what you got. And just be thankful for it.
You said earlier that you felt that Vietnam was a big waste. Has your military experience affected your feelings about war and military in general?
Yeah, we need to stay strong. Now, and I don't mind Trump saying that this is too expensive and that's too expensive, except he's just because he's a multi-billionaire doesn't mean he's got all the answers that he thinks he is. I'm not a Trump fan. I didn't vote for him. I didn't vote for Hillary either. But we need to stay strong, because there's people will take advantages if we don't. I'm convinced of that. I think we can be naive about Russia and ISIS and all that stuff. They're scary. I think they're very scary. I think they're scary like Nazism was in the 30s. So we need to keep. And I appreciated the other day when Trump said, or somebody, that they're going to watch the budget, except the military budget. It can continue to grow, and I think that's way past due. we need not to get let up on that area, even though it's expensive. It's amazing to me that an F-35 new fighter, they're $85 million. That thing was $3 million when I flew it. And that was a complex airplane in its day, but not compared to what they're flying today. But we still have to keep strong. We have to keep strong. I think the Air Force, the Navy, the Army, Marines, I think we need to keep strong.
Well, I have a couple more questions left for you. Is there anything you feel like we haven't discussed or should be added to this interview?
No, I can't think of anything.
And then, what message would you like to leave for future generations who will see this video?
Become involved with what's in the newspaper. Don't take it for granted. Don't listen to the news and there's too much of this Me Too generation. I think that just instead of becoming involved, I'm not involved in politics, but I sure do read about it and voice my opinions about it. I think young people need to discipline themselves and appreciate what they've got. And there's not enough of that around. There's not enough of that around.
This concludes our interview. Thank you for taking the time to do this interview with us, and thank you for your service.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that.